Good afternoon. Good afternoon, folks, for those of you on the East Coast, and good late morning for those on the West Coast. My name is Miles Taylor, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome you to the inaugural Renew America Movement Chat, RAM Chat. These are going to be conversations that we host on a weekly and bi-weekly basis with the nation's leading policymakers, thinkers, elected officials, and others driving the conversation about our democracy and the issues that matter. And today we are very excited to welcome our first guest for a RAM chat. But before I get to our first guest, I want to introduce my co-host today, which is Mary Anna Mancuso, who is part of the Renew America team. Mary Anna is one of the top communications advisors to RAM, and she brings over a decade of political and communications experience and digital strategy to the Renew America movement. Mary Anna has served in various campaign and communication roles, including serving as digital director for high-profile national and state campaigns. And without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today, who I'm very excited to have on the RAM Chat, someone who you've probably seen quite frequently on your television screens lately. She's been in the news because she makes the news and reports on it like no other. That is the esteemed Carol Leonnig, the Pulitzer Prize investigative reporter at the Washington Post. Carol has worked at the Washington Post since the year 2000, and in 2015, she won the Pulitzer Prize for her work on security failures and misconduct inside the Secret Service, an organization about which she wrote another recent best-selling book. And she was part of the Washington Post team that was awarded the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for her reporting about Edward Snowden and American surveillance. Carol is a three-time winner of the George Polk Award for Investigative Reporting, a frequent on-air contributor at NBC and MSNBC, and is the co-author with Phil Rucker of I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year, a book that was an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. Carol is a graduate of Bryn Mawr, and we are very delighted to welcome her today. So, Mary Anna, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Miles, and welcome, Carol. You know, I got a copy of your book, and I've got to be honest, I couldn't put it down. It was a compulsive read. So well done to you and Philip Rucker on this amazing book. And, you know, I just want to talk that your first book, A Very Stable Genius, you know, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America, which is a very fair assessment in your text, it came out just last year. Now, and I know that reading the acknowledgments of the book, which happened to be my favorite part of most books, because you really get into the meat and bones of what drove the authors and what inspired them and helped them stay accountable throughout writing it. But what decided that you guys needed to write a second book? Was there a moment, a catalyst of sorts? And what was it? Could you speak a little bit about that?
You know, first off, thank you both for having me. Thank you to RAM for, wanting to have a conversation about this book and the subject that underlies it, which is so important to our country, and bridging the huge chasm in our country right now. So thank you. Thank you also, Miles, for the warm introduction, and Mariana, you too. I love your question, and I'll get right to it, because we didn't want to write a second book. Phil Rucker and I have been partners in lots of things, but never so intensely as we were when we wrote about the first couple of years of Donald Trump's presidency. And it was exhausting. And we were, working very hard on a tight deadline to get as much information as we could from people inside an ongoing White House, an ongoing administration. And it was hard. And it was the first time we'd written a book, and it was the first time we'd written a book together. A lot of things about it were exhausting. But, right around the spring of 2020, as we were updating the paperback of The Stable Genius and working with our amazing editor at Penguin Press, we started to realize this year's different. Even just the pandemic alone probably wouldn't have spurred us to write a second book. And we were seeing the drastic and draconian qualities of that in the spring. But George Floyd's death and the clearing of Lafayette Square, the president's sort of authoritarian impulses that immediately had him at war with civil rights protesters, those things together started to compel us to go back and look at 2020 with a real deep shovel, and that was even before the election, the undermining of absentee ballots, and before January 6th. So the story only got, from a dramatic movie screenplay perspective, better, and from an American democracy perspective, so much worse.
That makes so much sense, and I completely agree. And, it's interesting, as I was reading the book, I kept thinking, oh, I want to highlight passages that are just so important. If that was the case, I would have run out of highlighter and the entire thing would have been highlighted. It read like a Stephen King novel. The horrible part, to your point, is that it was democracy in action in real world time. Now, so as you guys were researching and interviewing people, I know that you interviewed over 140 senior administrative officials. Did you see kind of, when you met with the president at Mar-a-Lago and he was outright denying the facts, which you had confirmed through multiple sources, how did that really impact your project to see almost a real-time preemptive denial of your work?
By the time we got to Mar-a-Lago, Phil and I had been reporting for many months and writing whole chapters. And we felt that we knew the story pretty well from the firsthand witnesses who lived it, the people who were by Donald Trump's side. And actually, to be fair, many of them, huge supporters of the president, people who wanted to execute his agenda, who wanted to implement it for him, who were rooting for his success. Many of those people explained to us just how panicky they became in the course of this year because of the degree to which Donald Trump was willing to put American lives in jeopardy, put the democracy in peril, all for sort of that short-term political gain, his desire to keep his grasp and his grip on the presidency and get reelected. And we knew a lot of the scenes and information when we headed down to Palm Beach to his very nice club. I think what we discovered, to the chagrin probably of Donald Trump, was his narrative had gotten increasingly divorced from reality. It had hardened over time, and it revealed a person who was so dug in to this concept of not being a loser that he really couldn't see reality, or he had very successfully convinced himself he had to keep lying about it. And I must just pause there for a second and say, I don't make a judgment about whether someone's lying unless I know they're intentionally telling something that's not true, that they know is not true. With Donald Trump, it's very difficult to make that conclusion because, as an investigative reporter, as a detective, he doesn't reveal any signs of deception. He's very physically and holistically committed to things that are demonstrably false.
Yeah, and I think listening to excerpts of that interview, and it's interesting, I shared it with my team earlier. I said, you have to listen to this. And one of them said, it sounds like they're in the lobby. I said, that's where he likes to take his interviews, is in the lobby, and kind of to show that he's important enough to have press come and speak with him. Now, one thing that you kind of mentioned is that Trump seemed, he couldn't really grasp almost intuitively that he couldn't control the narrative. And, even though he fabricated it entirely from, fake news to conspiracy theories to outright lies, sometimes even the things about himself, he created this alternate reality. And I want to know, as a journalist, how does that kind of hostility to the truth, how does that affect a book that you're writing such as this?
I think less, Mariana, about how it affects the book and how it affects the country. Our book will stand the test of time. We know it's corroborated. We know because, well, to be fair, we fact-checked it with everyone who was there, and we fact-checked it with Donald Trump. So he can, claim that it's not true, but everything that's in that book, he has been made aware of. And if he disputed something that was in question, we included his dispute. But in large measure, he accepted as real and true what many of his aides, advisors, and cabinet members had told us. As for his rejection, his embrace of this alternate reality, I think about it a lot in terms of how successful he has been, and let's give him credit for it, as dangerous as it is, his success at mastering that megaphone of touching and reaching down and tapping into the anger and fear that exists in a large portion of American society, of stoking that fear and that anger, and making a large segment of the population and the voting population believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that he's their defender, that he is looking out for them. While his policies haven't really benefited the people who voted for him, they're still in lockstep believing many of the things he claims, at their peril. As you know, some ICU wards have been filled with people who said, wait a minute, I thought the coronavirus was a hoax.
Yes, and it's been absolutely sad to watch that happen. And, interestingly, I watched the interview with you and Philip Rucker on C-SPAN, and what I found most alarming was his supporters calling in and saying things such as, no matter what you print, no matter what you say, even though it has been fact-checked, I am not going to believe it. Nothing you say or write will ever make me wane in my support for Donald Trump. And it really shows to me that in today's society, we see two different realities, the reality based in truth and fact, and this alternate reality. And I would ask you, kind of as a follow-up, how do we get back to a shared reality, and what will it take to get general truths about actual events, many in your book? And I will credit you guys, when he did dispute something, you even said point blank, Trump through people said this was not true. And so I applaud you guys for meeting him right there in that moment. But how do we get to this moment of being widely accepted and understood as a shared reality?
I also completely applaud your phrasing, shared reality. We're probably, sadly, not going to get back to a place very soon that I call the Walter Cronkite era, when people gathered around their television at 5 or 6 o'clock at night, watched the same news, embraced it as the truth, and believed it because it was true. It's going to be a while before we get back there. And that is my number one concern as a journalist. I know how hard my colleagues and I work, and even my competitors who, I'm fighting against to beat them, but I respect them. I know how hard we're all working to corroborate information, the amount of information we don't publish because it hasn't met our very high standard for cross-checking and vetting and ensuring that it's all solid, rock solid. If I'm doing all this work for nothing, people don't believe it. The interview you described in C-SPAN, that was like a knife in my heart, hearing that person describe, no matter what you do, I'm not going to believe what you say. I believe the only solution, at least from a journalist's perspective, and this is different for activists and advocates, but from a journalist's perception, the only route forward is to show more of our work, kind of like math class. Explain and explain and explain how we get our information, but to the degree that we can. It's why I tell people, we fact check this book with Donald Trump. Just so you know, we went to him and his spokespeople and we listed 327 things we were going to say. And we asked him if he disputed any of them. And when he did, and he could not be proven wrong by the actual documents at our hands, we included his dispute. And those are a fraction of the cases. So back to the bigger point, show our work, explain to the reader, explain to the audience, the viewer, how did we get this information? Why did we look for it? We're not in the business of ginning up fake news. That's the antithesis of what we do. For advocates and activists, as I assume, Renew America has a lot of followers in that camp. I can't prescribe what to do except more conversations around fact.
Now, I want to turn to probably the most significant of these alternate realities, and I really want to dig into Trump's efforts to declare the election rigged. Now, ultimately, he wanted to overturn it. And what struck me in the book, which I am really shocked that, more people are not just absolutely enraged and just gobsmacked over that the night before the election, Bill Barr calls Mark Esper and says, Trump's telling his advisors that if he's losing in the vote count, he's just going to declare himself the winner. Now, to that point, we know that on election night, as you guys had reported in the book, Giuliani has this grand plan, and he starts telling Stepien, Miller, and Meadows to say Trump won state after state. And to their credit, they're actually saying, as you know in the book, they, quote, thought his argument was both incoherent and irresponsible. And Meadows tells Giuliani, quote, we can't do that. Do you think Giuliani's grand plan of this big lie would have actually gained traction in the way had it not been determined that he was absolutely adamant about getting the president's ear? And do you think that he was kind of the catalyst to embolden Trump to peddle this conspiracy theory of the election being stolen from him?
Rudy Giuliani was definitely one of a small flock of whisperers in Trump's ear after the election who were continually telling him in different examples all the ways in which Biden votes had been ginned up. Trump votes had been thrown in a river. Fake Biden votes had been created by, as Donald Trump told Phil and me in Mar-a-Lago, by Indians who had been paid, whoever the Indians are that had been paid. I assume he means Native Americans. You know, what's so striking about this, Mariana, is a person who had been loyal to the nth degree to Donald Trump, a person who wanted to see him reelected, who took a lot of steps infuriating the Department of Justice family to try to help Donald Trump politically. Bill Barr, the Attorney General. He sat down with Trump in December and said, Mr. President, the emperor has no clothes. We have to accept that the election was fair. There may have been fraud, as he told Trump, but not fraud on a scale that would have changed any state results. Not that kind of degree. And he went through point by point of all the strange examples and anecdotes that Rudy Giuliani kind of vomited up, or Michael Flynn offered, or Sidney Powell, the lawyer who famously suggested that a software created by Hugo Chavez to help elect him in Venezuela had somehow miraculously been imported to the United States. Some sort of trigger had been, some sort of switch had been flicked, and Biden votes were being manufactured out of thin air.
Or the water main break.
The water main break, or the valises of ballots. Each one, Bill Barr said, just so you know, Donald Trump, Mr. President, just so you know, I have the entire Department of Justice at my disposal. I set up a task force of people, prosecutors and FBI agents, to investigate all of these claims. And so far, they're all bull blank. Those were his words. So Donald Trump didn't want to hear those words. And Rudy Giuliani, to your very good point, was the person saying what the president wanted to hear. And increasingly, just as he had pushed away people like Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and Tillerson at the beginning of his presidency, now he's starting to push away Barr and Esper, Secretary of Defense, and anyone who tries to give him sort of a reality check. Chris Christie, somebody who'd been really a big supporter and advocate for the president. The president can't accept anything that he's saying about the election.
Yeah. Now, to your point, as we were talking about Bill Barr, since your book was published, I can't even believe that now we're starting to see new documents that are showing just how far the efforts to undermine the election went, including meetings with the DOJ where officials were asking them to just say the election is corrupt and leave the rest to me. How far Trump and his team were on this mission to discredit the election. And one question that I really am kind of dying to know is if you've heard any rumors. Again, I'm not asking you to release your sources, but if you've heard any rumors or examples like this that didn't make it into your book.
Nice try. This book's more than 500 pages long to cover 1 year, right? And it was more than 500 pages to cover 2.5 years before. So if there was anything really good that we corroborated, it's in this book. And not that we were, throwing in extra carrots into the stew. If it was important, it was in there. There are things I've heard, but it would be irresponsible to share things that didn't meet our high standard in our test and just stir the pot with speculation. I will say though that what's really amazing is how much Barr put his body in front of sort of the crazy zaniness that Trump and some of these fringe supporters were trying to peddle, some of the efforts they were pushing to try to keep him in power, stop the certification. And when Barr was making his careful exit, remember, he and Trump have a huge falling out in October, but it explodes on December 1st when Barr says to the Associated Press in a very calculated interview, hey, there's not enough evidence of actual fraud in this election. That sets Trump's hair on fire. They have an amazing fight. And Barr is trying to find a careful exit from the White House. He doesn't want to be fired by tweet. He doesn't want this relationship to be a burning barn. He wants to get out carefully. And he does so December 14th. And the way he does it is by flattering the president with a letter he says he'll release publicly. When he is making that exit, he thinks to himself, and he shares this with confidants later who told us about it, Barr says to himself, what bad things can happen? There's only a few more days left in this presidency. And I think Rosen and Donahue can hold down the fort. Those are the acting attorney general and the acting deputy attorney general who would fill in for him. And in fact, what happens is Trump, almost like water finding the weak part of a roof, starts pouring down into that part of the roof, pummeling Rosen, pummeling Donahue, working overtime to try to make some public claim. Remember, it doesn't have to be factual. Make some public claim that the investigation, the election is in doubt. It's sort of the same thing. It's part of his whole playbook with, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, where he says, just announce that there's an investigation of Biden. Just announce that. It doesn't have to be a real thing.
It's astounding. And we know that we've seen just through the timeline. I mean, your book does a fantastic job of laying out such a detailed timeline that the lie of the election being stolen led to the events of January 6th. And one thing that you often hear from Republicans who may condemn January 6th attack, but were against impeachment or hearings on it, is that, quote, it wasn't a coup. There was no plan to overthrow the election. Now, given everything you found about the coordinated efforts to contest and undermine the election and your reporting from that day, how do you respond to that?
I mean, it's all in front of our faces on live television, and we can replay the tapes. President Trump, in a call and response, summoned people repeatedly to Washington. He told them, and he got his supporters to tell people that the election could not be certified, that Vice President Pence should not certify the election, that it could not go forward, that it was rigged, that it was fraudulent. And he wanted his supporters to come to the streets to stop it. And he confirmed that in our interview when we talked to him in Mar-a-Lago. He said he was sorry about the violence. He wished that hadn't happened, but he wanted what his supporters wanted. And the supporters over and over again have told federal prosecutors and courts of law and FBI agents, we came here to do what the president asked us to do, which is stop the election, and stop the peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah, I mean, the story that your book tells regarding these last-ditch efforts is just enthralling. It's also terrifying. I mean, this is things that I can only hope that people studying history going forward in schools will read about to understand. But we even see figures who stepped in at crucial moments to say, no, this is unacceptable. I'm not doing this. And at Renew America, we want to support and defend democracy. And if someone were to field this playbook again in the future, what do concerned citizens look for, even in politicians they support, like that says that we're headed for a crisis of democracy? And how do we stop that?
Well, I mean, I think the road of the Trump presidency is littered with red flags that everybody blew past. The president's constant rejection of alliances that keep America safe, the president's constant desire to become buddies with authoritarian leaders, his rebuffing of good legal counsel about what was legal, his efforts to undermine the rule of law that would govern him, and not just govern the people. So I think that we're, as a country, we're to blame for, as a group, not paying better attention to those red flags. They were reported pretty thoroughly, but they were all there to be seen, about what the president believed he could do to implement his will. And his will eventually became, his North Star became just keeping hold of power, remaining president. And it looked like he would be willing to do anything for it. I want to say something that doesn't really answer your question, but I think your question smartly elicits this. Many of the sources that Phil and I spoke to for the book had been quite grim about the ability of someone to take democracy out at the knees. If they had been, as they said it to us, and I'm mushing their comments into one, if Donald Trump had been more efficient, more disciplined, more organized, if he had not been such an impulsive politician, making sort of game day calls, if he had been more on par with other authoritarian leaders that had an orderly strategy, he may have been able to indeed launch that coup and successfully support that insurrection on January 6th. And the democracy was in peril, much more than we realized when we started reporting this book. And what the sources told us over and over again was they worry about the next time with somebody who's just better at it.
And to your point about worrying about what happens next time, were there inflection points or a time, maybe even in hindsight, you think that should have triggered a bigger response from the public?
There are many, but I'll give you two examples for a moment. The first one that comes to mind was the president instantly undermining absentee ballots in the midst of a pandemic. That very early, long before anybody even considered receiving an absentee ballot, that effort to undermine the election from the earliest days was a big whistle that I don't think people listened to closely enough. It was a whistle that said he's questioning something that no president has ever questioned before. He's trying to weaken and soften up the underbelly of something we've always treated as sort of Teflon. That's a biggie. The second one, I think, was Lafayette Square. When the president was willing to use force to remove people who were exercising their legal constitutional rights, the way in which he did that for what? A video showing him walking across a park and looking tough. I think that told you a lot about what was important to him. And it's why Chairman Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, began to tell his colleagues he saw in Trump the gospel of the Führer. He saw a person, if not disciplined, if not organized, at least mimicking the moves of Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm. And those were some scary moments. And what stands out to me is that later he starts hopping on a call with two other people of the administration, one of them being Mark Meadows, and they're comparing notes as they lead into all of this. So, yeah, I mean, just so many moments where you're, I'm clutching my pearls and my hands over my mouth going, oh my gosh, how did we survive this as a nation? And giving thanks to God we were able to. So now Trump made history as the only president to ever be impeached twice. And he's often been likened to as Richard Nixon. And I think that one of the questions that has loomed in my mind, and I'd be curious your thoughts, and granted, I know that you're not a political operative or an analyst on this, but what extent do you think that January 6th will play a role in the futures of the Steve Millers and the Mark Meadows? Do you think that they'll have a seat at the table, even though their association with Trump standing by him all the way to the end of the administration? How does this kind of their ability to peddle conspiracy theories affect the future of their career?
Well, I think that both individuals have struggled to find employment outside the Donald Trump orbit. And I think that's an early indicator. And I don't wish either of them ill, by the way. I'm not in that business. I'm in the business of reporting what they did, what they said, and getting it right. I notice that a lot of Republicans are trumpeting exactly what Donald Trump is saying and has said to us at Mar-a-Lago as part of their own self-preservation plan, as part of their plan to grab hold of the Trump base, the famous Trump base, those people whose fears and angers Donald Trump stoked when he was in office and continues to try to manipulate for his own political benefit. Well, so are so many members of the GOP who are in congressional offices and facing races or want to become, say, the Speaker of the House, Mr. McCarthy. They're all singing from that same hymn book, and voters aren't judging them. The voters in their states are very happy with what those individuals are singing. So I wouldn't count that people are going to be punished for following Donald Trump's lead or sticking in his camp until the end.
It's incredible, right? You think at any other point in time in history, people would be, scattering in droves, but apparently not. So I know that we're running short on time. And one of the final things I wanted to just kind of pick your brain on was your thoughts on 2024. And we're 3 years away, and so much can happen in order for Trump to continue to have this shadow, my second presidency happening in Mar-a-Lago, which, I mean, even reading in the epilogue, when he walks out onto the patio and everybody stands on cue and applauds, it was just like this weird alternate reality. But do you think that Trump is still the leader of Trumpism, or are there many, young acolytes that are willing to take the mantle from him? And do you think that he's going to run again?
When we were with him, Mariana, in Palm Beach, I have to say he sounded like a man who's running for president. He sounded like a person who was excited about it, who was eyeing it almost deliciously and almost with a goal of being vindicated. That if this is his reality, that it was stolen from him, now he's going to steal it back or take it back. It's a long time off, as you rightly point out, and he's not a young man. So we'll see about his health and about his vigor. But he was a pretty old man in his first presidency, and he stayed kind of tough and strong, which is what one of his big goals, one of his big priorities was to look tough and strong. He beat COVID with the monoclonal antibodies. So we'll see. But I would tell you that don't count Donald Trump out. He was surprised in 2016 to become president, very surprised. And then he fell in love with the job, fell in love with the power. I don't know that he fell in love with doing the job, but he fell in love with being in it, and he wants it back.
It's incredible to me because, well, he wasn't somebody who excelled at living up to the office, as you've pointed out. He sure as heck really enjoyed himself as the president, and it seems like that's something he doesn't want to let go. One thing I've often wondered about is the desire to run, knowing that he might not actually win again. And I think that, we see in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis is already running a 2024 campaign. And when we think about the kind of a Trump matchup, I've seen this, and I hate to even bring this up, but I'm kind of there, so I'm just going to own it. But on Twitter, I saw a T-shirt that said DeSantis Trump 24. I immediately had to leave Twitter. I was like, that's enough for today. Do you think that there's a possibility, because how does he choose his next running mate? Mike Pence, as we pointed out in the book, and you've said in previous interviews, he was the ultimate lieutenant soldier, whatever he needed, until January 6th, when he refused to carry the water and abided by his constitutional duties. How does Trump pick a running mate, like somebody like that?
Of course, it's going to all be about loyalty and again, singing that same song, supporting something that we all can see is demonstrably false and promoting it with the public. One of the things that Pence had going for him with Donald Trump was that he constantly nodded and acquiesced to everything Trump wanted. And constantly, every time he was at a lectern or at a microphone, he talked about how strong and brilliant Donald Trump was. That's what the next vice presidential candidate will have to do as well. And there'll be no disagreeing. There'll be nothing, no distance, no daylight between them. One thing that I want to add, since I see the picture of Lincoln on your bookshelf behind, is just to remind everybody that in our interview with Donald Trump, he said that his presidency was one of the best in history, and that if George Washington and Abe Lincoln came back from the dead and teamed up against him, he would still win.
That really also, I didn't even know how to respond. Again, it was one of those things where I cannot highlight the book because I would run out of highlighter ink and the entire book would be covered. But it was so fantastic. And Carol, we're going to bring Miles in to kind of close us out. But to all of you watching at home, I cannot recommend enough I Alone Can Fix It by Carol Leonnig and Philip Rucker. A fantastic read. I mean, clear your weekend, folks, because you're not going to be able to put it down. It was just absolutely incredible. And kudos to you guys for having the courage to come forward and write these things and show the truth and shine a light into the darkness of that was Donald Trump's administration.
Mariana, thank you so much. Great questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you were a close reader.
Well, Carol, let me also extend my thanks. There's probably a more artful way to put this, but you and Phil have both been sort of the nation's body cam in America's capital for a number of years here, really covering the events that people should see. And your book absolutely pulls back the veil on some of these pretty disturbing episodes. So thank you for that. Thank you for your public service, Carol. And you all deserve every accolade that this book has received. So very well done. And thank you again for joining us today. And I will close by noting, thank you so much. I'll close by noting for folks who are watching, we have several very exciting RAM chats coming up in the next few weeks. Officer Fanone, U.S. Capitol Police Officer Michael Fanone will be on with us. Former whistleblower and Trump administration official Alexander Vindman, and a number of other exciting guests in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. Follow us online at renewamericamovement.com or on Twitter at RenewAmerica. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day, everyone. And a big thanks again to Carol Leonnig for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.